All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Personal Statement Workshop. Excited to be with you all today. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me okay? See my screen okay? All good stuff? Thumbs up? Okay, sounds good. All right, so as we go through this presentation, of course, feel free to leave your questions and comments in the chat. All right. Okay, so hi everybody, welcome. I'm sure that you all know me by now and are probably a little bit sick of me, but I'm Amanda Kong, she, her pronouns. I'm one of the pre-health advisors here at Tyson, and I'll let Sonia introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sonia Gordillo, she, her, ella pronouns, also one of the other pre-health advisors here in Tyson College and Career Advising. And then Amanda posted that sign-in sheet in the chat, so feel free to fill that out. As always, there's identifying information in there. If you feel comfortable to share that, that would be helpful for us so that we can see who's attending our workshops and how to better support different students and populations on campus.
Thank you very much. All right, so also sad to disappoint you guys, but I'm going to take the lead on this workshop. It'll be mostly me today because my background is actually in writing. So I am coming from an English background. I have taught composition classes for, gosh, 8 years or so. So, I am pretty familiar with all of the aspects of writing, including how terrible it is, how hard it is, and also how embarrassing it is to write something like this, right? So hopefully through this workshop, you get a sense of what is supposed to go in this kind of statement, which will make you hopefully feel a little bit more comfortable about writing. Okay, so what is a personal statement, right? So a strong personal statement does these things, right? It answers the question of the prompt. It stays away from stereotypes and cliches. It is a good reflection on the experiences that you've had. And those experiences should be connecting to things that make you a memorable candidate, right? Um, my number one rule with personal statements is always that it doesn't necessarily have to be true, but it does have to be memorable. So many of us go through life, just experiencing it, right? We're not really thinking at every moment and reflecting on every moment, like, oh, that was the point when I wanted to do healthcare. Oh, this is, an experience that is really motivating me to do this, right? So oftentimes we have to like look back at our memories and then say, okay, you know what? I don't know if I had that thought then, but looking back, that might have been a great time to have that thought of, yeah, I should be doing healthcare, right? And so that's what I mean when I say it doesn't necessarily have to be true, right? So we don't have to be super 100% yes, that was the exact moment in time when I knew it, right? But of course, at the same time, I'm not encouraging you to lie about it, right? It is more about reframing your experiences. Okay. So what is the question that you're supposed to answer in a personal statement? This can vary from application to application. Some applications have very specific questions. For example, this one from the PT app. Every person has a background and identity and interests or talents, which they feel their application would be incomplete without having mentioned. Describe the traits or experiences that make you unique and explain how they will help you be a successful physical therapist. So this is a very specific question, but it's also kind of a variation on the very general questions that almost all of these applications are having you answer, which is, why do you want to do this job, right? Why do you want to be a physician? Why do you want to be a physician's associate? Why do you want to be a physical therapist, right? Why dentistry, right? What is the thing that is motivating you to do this? Why would you make a good blank, right? Um, what are the stereotypes and cliches? So ultimately, whenever I ask students, like, why do you want to do this healthcare career, right? They always say that they want to help people, right? That is the baseline, right? So one of the key aspects of writing, which makes it really easy to do, is one, know your audience, right? The audience for your personal statement is going to be practicing, professionals. It's going to be faculty members who teach that profession. It's also going to be professional people who are just like professionals at reading applications, right? And sifting through all of that information. So these are all people who know your profession, right? They know the basic rules of it. They know what it's like. They know the day to day. You don't have to explain any of that to them, right? The thing that you have to explain, right, is what are the experiences that have led you down this path and made you decide that you want to commit yourself to this profession, right? Saying that you love science is great, but it doesn't tell us why you're committed to this profession, right? I love that you love learning, right? But how does that demonstrate that you're academically ready to do the school part of your professional degree, right? So we're really wanting to get away from stereotypes and cliches and to make it more specific to you and your journey. One, that's one of the ways that you're going to be memorable, right? Two, the personal statement is really the only chance, right? The first and only chance that many of these people will get to know you. The same people who read your application may not be the same people who are interviewing you, right? They may not be the same people who are making the decision on whether or not to admit you at the end. Because usually, what these application processes are like is that it's a big committee. People are reviewing, applications get like 3 or 4 reviewers who score them or rate them on a specific scale. And then they write, recommendations, right? Like, I would rank this person 1. I would recommend we accept this person. I think this person should come in for an interview. And then there's another sort of like mini committee who like makes those decisions, right, on who to ask for interviews and who to admit once they've seen like the kind of whole ranking scale, right? So you want to make sure that you are being clear to each one of these readers, right? And that's really the kind of perspective that I would love for y'all to adopt about your writing, right? How can I see this from the point of view of somebody on that admissions committee, right? How do I see my personal statement from the point of view of a stranger? What are they learning about me and my career path from the actual words on the page, right? And how do you do this? Well, there's a variety of ways to start, right? So number one, I encourage everybody to start with a concrete pre-writing process, right? Don't just think about it in your head. You actually do want to do some writing. Now, the way that you do that can vary. So for example, we have this book right here that is about a wandering map, right? There are different names for this kind of strategy. It's also called like a cluster map, right? But basically, you're brainstorming. You're getting a big sheet of paper. You're writing down all of your major, memories, your major experiences, the classes that you thought were the hardest, the classes that you thought were the easiest, right? You're really just thinking about all of the things that are kind of going into making you a good healthcare professional, right? Just write them down, right? No need to put them in order. Don't think about them in terms of importance, right? The rule here is to just get everything out of your head and onto the page. Once it's onto the page, that's when you can start actually working with it, right? You can draw lines to make connections. You maybe are looking at this and you're realizing, okay, 6 or 7 of these ideas have a common, thread or theme. These ideas seem like a little bit more random and out of left field. Maybe I'll cut those out and I'll focus on these areas, right? So having that good concrete process where you're actually writing down the things from your head onto paper or a computer screen or something can be super helpful and beneficial because it, one, helps you discover things that you didn't really think were relevant, but could be relevant, right? Two, once you see these things on the page, it becomes much easier, again, to see those common themes, to understand, okay, this story is really great for showing off this aspect of my personality, but this story is really great for this different aspect, right? And once you've got everything on the paper, you can kind of start to work with it, start to organize it, and start to make those decisions about what goes into your personal statement and what does not, right? You can see a couple of examples here. So these are, very visual, concrete ways. Some students are really comfortable with outlining. Some students are not. Some students really love free writing, right? I really encourage you to do the pre-writing process that feels good to you because honestly, the number one thing that prevents anybody from writing anything good is anxiety, right? You have too much anxiety about what you want to say, how people are going to read it. It leads you to procrastinate. Then you just don't do a good as job as you want to do, right? So again, getting that stuff out on the page in a way that feels comfortable to you is the key here. All right. So here are some questions for brainstorming, right? Again, why can you really only see yourself being this profession, right? Why this profession over other professions? What is it about this profession that turned you onto this field? Who do you want to be for your patients? How do you want to treat your patients, right? What are the, things that you're going to do specifically for your patients that only you can do, which are, again, very tricky and big questions. But remember that not everybody has the same experiences that you do, right? As you go through, your memories and your experiences, realize that, of course, you have a very different path than everybody else, right? You made your choices and that led you down, a certain way, right? So that's what's unique about it, right? You have a combination of experiences and knowledge that nobody else has because nobody else is you, right? So what do you do with that, right? How are you going to take the things that you've learned from your undergrad experience, from your extracurricular experiences, and how are they informing the way that you're going to treat your patients, the way that you're going to treat your coworkers, all of those things, right? Yes, we're going to talk about that in a second once we get to the drafting part of this presentation, right? And I do that on purpose because right now in the pre-writing phase, in the brainstorming phase, I really don't want anybody to be thinking about word count or character count, right? The goal here at this point of the process is to overwrite. I really want you to put everything you can think of in this personal statement and let me or Sonia tell you what to get rid of, right? Because it's really easy to cut stuff out than it is to add stuff in later on, right? So that's really the goal here, is to just write as much as you can. All right, and this is part of that, right? So part of this brainstorming process is thinking about which experiences to talk about in the personal statement. If you've been to the other deep dive workshops this quarter, you'll know that we talk about the personal statement as just a part of your application, right? And it's working with those other parts of your application. So think about what experiences make the most sense in your personal statement versus your activity section versus the kind of stories that you're going to tell in your interview, right? And sometimes you make these decisions based on like practicalities. For example, today I reviewed a personal statement where I said, oh, this is actually a really great example, but we need more context to understand it. Therefore, I think you should move it to the interview because you don't actually have enough space to give us enough explanation to really be able to understand your example here, right? So when you are doing this brainstorming, and your supplemental and your secondary essays, right? When you're doing this brainstorming, again, you want to think about what you want to show off about yourself in your personal statement, what makes sense to show off in these other parts, right? So think about the competencies, right, that your professional program is going for, right? Do you have specific experiences that really match up to those competencies well, right? Think about unrelated experiences, right? So for example, if you've been working in retail, you probably have excellent customer service skills, right? How can that translate to the way that you talk to patients, right? If you're a learning assistant, right, you learn how to communicate concepts to people, right? How are you going to take the lessons that you learned from that and apply them to explaining a diagnosis to or a plan of treatment to your patient, right? So we really, again, want to think about every single experience possible, get them all down, and then start looking at them and sorting them out and making those decisions. Okay. Here are some brainstorming questions. I won't go through them. I'll just leave them on the slide. And then as you're working through your personal statement stuff, you can look at the PowerPoint, you can look at these questions and use them to help you get started on, free writing a draft or brainstorming or doing it, right? But some key things to know about here is do not be afraid of talking about moments of struggle and failure, right? So for example, if you are really kind of nervous about your chemistry grades, right? Maybe you didn't do as well as you wanted to in that first set of general chemistry, but maybe by the time you're taking OChem, you're more on top of your studying and you had much, much better grades, right? It can be tempting to try to kind of hide that first set of grades and not talk about it and not address it. But think about how compelling it might be to talk about why you got a bad grade in general chemistry. What were the concrete strategies that allowed you to improve and progress, and how you ended up getting the stellar grades in OChem, right? That's a great story to show, resilience, to show grit, to show determination, right? To show maturity. All of these schools are looking for people who are not going to burn out, right? That is the number one sort of danger in many of these healthcare professions, right? That you're going to take on too much and you're not going to be able to do it all, right? So you want to demonstrate that you are aware of your needs, that you're aware of your capacities, right? And that you're paying attention to them. Because of course, if you're a super burnt out physician or physical therapist, you can't be good to your patients, because if you're not good, right? If you're struggling, think about how that impacts your studies. It's also going to impact your professional life, right? So think about what kinds of aspects of your character or personality are being, shown through these examples, right? Okay, so okay, here we go. What to look for when you look at examples. I forgot that I put this slide here and not later. So the temptation, of course, when we're starting to do this work, right, is that we want to look at a bunch of examples of personal statements from other people who are trying to get into those programs, right? That's great. I think that that's super helpful, but I do think that students can kind of approach these examples in the wrong way, right? So a lot of times students will read these examples and think, oh, these are the things that I have to talk about. Or, oh, I really need to talk up my struggles with race or money, in order to get in, right? No, right? These are not true. When you look at these examples, I don't really want you to look at like the content per se. Instead, I want you to look more at the style, right? So think about it like this. Instead of saying like, okay, this person wrote about, how they were super poor, I should write about that too, right? Instead, think about, okay, what did they spend their first paragraph doing, right? What does that first paragraph say about them? What does the second paragraph say? What is the purpose of that third paragraph, right? Um, how do they start their essay? How do they end their essay? For me, first and last sentences are huge, right? Because one, they frame how you're going to understand the rest of what's being written, right? And they also tell you what to take away from what you just read, right? So these are incredibly key points in your personal statement to be really direct and to be able to tell your reader exactly what you want from them, right? So when you're looking at these examples, again, look at these, sort of more analytical things, right? Rather than the content of what they're writing, right? If you feel, moved or emotional when you're reading it, that's great, that's fine. But take a look at where that emotion is happening and ask yourself, how did they get me to feel that, right? What were the sentences that made me really engage with this, right? And think about, how can I frame my experiences in kind of the same way, right? How can I get someone to feel something when they're reading my personal statement, right? That's more of what I want y'all to pay attention to rather than what they talk about in their personal statement, right? Okay, so now here we are in finally the sort of drafting section of the presentation, right? So that was all pre-writing. That's all the kind of stuff that you should probably be doing right now if you're applying this cycle, right? So get started on that brainstorming, start reflecting on all of your experiences, right? As you finish that, right, we're going to then move on again, like I said, to making those kinds of choices about what goes into your personal statement. So what does go into your personal statement? Your personal statement should have these elements, right? So your first paragraph should be a kind of opening story, right? I think many of you are very familiar with this. That's kind of like the number one thing that jumps out at you from all of those examples, right? So they always have like this weird personal story at the beginning, right? So this story should establish a kind of brand, a controlling theme, or a kind of metaphor that you use throughout your application, right? So remember when I said that you want to be memorable, right? Think about the way that poems and songs are memorable. It's a lot of repetition, you know what I mean? Same thing here, right? So for example, if you have a music hobby, right? How can we frame your approach to healthcare with these music terms, right? How can we drop in things like, oh, I'm going to be, helping patients work towards harmony in their body, right? Or helping patients vocalize concerns. Or maybe you observed a certain rhythm in the way a medical team worked during, your observation and your shadowing, right? So again, you're thinking about the ways that you can kind of subtly reinforce your brand as that music person, right? That one person who talked about music a lot in their application. It may seem weird, but again, you want to be weird. You want to be memorable. You want to be the kind of person that the admissions counselor, goes home and says, hey, I read this really wild personal statement today. Let me tell you about it, right? So using these kinds of little tips and tricks can again really reinforce your brand as like that music, guy, that music gal, right? That music person. Um, After and that opening paragraph, it could be one, it could be two paragraphs, but they should be relatively short. We do have a very specific amount of space, right? Generally, I think personal statements are usually in between like 1,500 and 1,700 characters for the most part. They can be more, of course. Sometimes they are a little bit less, it's hard to kind of visualize that in terms of length, right? Because we're not really thinking about character counts, right? We're not thinking about counting spaces or counting punctuation, right? So what I would say is generally personal statements are about 1.5 pages single spaced. It's a very, very short amount of space in order to kind of transmit a lot of information as you go, right? So that means every single word counts, right? We got to be efficient here. So your first couple of paragraphs, maybe one or two, are this opening story, but again, they're very short. Your next 1 to 2 paragraphs are going to be paragraphs that discuss your academic path, your extracurriculars. Oh yeah, for MD, it's 5,300 characters. So yeah, like I said, it can be anywhere from kind of 1,500 to 1,700. It could go up to that 5,000, 6,000 range. Again, really depends on the program. Some programs really want short, kind of like more cover letter style personal statements. Some of them give you more space. Look that up, right? Do your research and make sure. Okay, so then you're going to have these 1 to 2 paragraphs that discuss your academic path, your extracurriculars, how they've shaped your unique approach to healthcare or prepared you for the profession. So again, you're not mentioning every single class. You're not mentioning every single experience. You're talking about the ones that are going to be most relevant to your profession, right? And then your final paragraph, right, is one that expresses your motivations for pursuing this path and maybe talks about your future career goals, right? Or identifying areas of specialty interest. So say you want to become a pediatrician, right? You want to end your personal statement by talking about why you want to become a pediatrician. Maybe you want to do a specific area of children's medicine. Maybe you want to do like NICU stuff, right? Maybe you want to really go into behavioral health in pediatrics, right? You don't have to have that level of specificity, but if you do, this is where you put it, right? If you don't have that level of special interest yet, that's totally fine, right? Again, think about, more broadly what kind of health professional you want to be, right? Do you want to help a specific population or a specific, area, right? Are you maybe interested in working in that more, team-based approach, right? Maybe you're really interested in becoming more of an educator, right? Any of those things, right, could be here, So when we're talking about future career goals, again, you don't have to be too specific, but you do want to kind of highlight, right, the possibilities of where this career could take you that you might be interested in, right? Because again, you're showing that forward thinking. You're showing that you're committing to this, that you have this long view, that you're not just thinking about the next 4 years, but you're thinking about the next 10 years, right, into the future. Okay. Okay, so as I said, here we are in the drafting part. So please remember, it's a process. You're going to have multiple drafts. This is not the kind of thing that you can just write the night before, right? And generally students are not doing that, right? I don't want to, assume anything, but I think especially if you're a good writer, you can have the sense of like, oh, I find writing easy, like I'll get to it later. But the personal statement is actually one of the most important pieces of your application, and it can make or break you. So I want you to spend the appropriate amount of time, right? So when you're thinking about coming up with a kind of schedule for your personal statement, you want to be thinking about about your past writing experience, right? So are you a slow writer or are you a fast writer? Again, neither of those things, tells you whether you're good or bad, right? But they do tell you how much time you need to budget for this project, right? Are you a writer who writes in small chunks of time over a long period of time? Or are you a marathon writer like me where I can write, like all of one project in one day and I just want to spend the whole day on it, right? Think about that, right? Because you want to think about, right, how you're going to get people to look at your draft, right? You're producing this on your own schedule, but once you hand over your draft to somebody else, you have to acknowledge their schedule too. So are you coming up with a schedule of drafting that allows you time to send your draft to different people, have them read it, give you feedback, and then do you have time to incorporate that feedback into the next draft, right? So be thinking about that when you're thinking about your timeline. Also think about, when you have issues writing, right? So what is the trickiest part of writing for you? Do you really struggle with the introduction? Do you really struggle with the conclusion? Do you really struggle with the organization? Is it just hard for you to get started, right? Again, think about those and think about budgeting that time. If you really struggle with the conclusion, again, maybe you want to write that first, and kind of think about where you want to land. And then maybe get some feedback on it from one of us, right? To help you kind of think about how to streamline the rest of your materials to that conclusion, maybe you have problems starting, in which case come in and talk to us, right? Do your brainstorming with us so that you feel like you have more of a sense of direction, right? What's key here is that I want you to be identifying parts of this process where you might need to ask for help. And because both of us, have a schedule that tends to fill up really fast, right? I want y'all to have the time to be able to reach out and to get feedback from us so that you feel comfortable proceeding in the rest of the drafting process, okay? Plan for at least 3 drafts and plan to have at least 3 different people read your drafts. Now, that doesn't mean that their feedback is going to be relevant, right? Because again, I'm asking you to think about this from the perspective of your reader, right? When you're writing, your brain is moving way faster than your fingers. I tell my students this all the time. Your brain is going so fast and your fingers are moving so slow. Sometimes the things that you think that you said didn't actually make it onto the page, right? It happens all the time. I ask students, what did you mean by this? And they go, oh, well, I did this, this, and this, and I want to talk about that. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But like, you literally didn't tell me any of those details here, right? And they go, oh, you're right, So it's really about, having that kind of mindset and being able to see like, okay, it wasn't that I need to add this. It's that I added a sentence that maybe miscommunicated what I was thinking. And I can see that because my reader thinks I was talking about this. So you can actually disregard that feedback because it's based on miscommunication, right? All you need to do is go back and fix that sentence so it's more accurate to what you're saying. You don't necessarily need to take into account what your friend or your feedback giver has said, because it might just be an issue of like, oh, I accidentally forgot a detail. Now they're confused, right? So you do want to, be thinking about your drafts as in, am I saying what I really want to say? Those are the first 2 drafts that you're going to write. Then your third and your fourth draft or whatever is going to be more about, is this the best way to say what I'm trying to say? Right? So the first part of drafting is really figuring out what you want to include, what you want to talk about, what you're really trying to get at in terms of showcasing yourself and your personality. And then the next part of the revision process is going to be more about that kind of technical detail and aspects of it. Okay. It may take more than 3 drafts. When I was writing my dissertation proposal, I did 7 drafts. When I was writing my personal statement for PhD programs, I did 4 drafts. It's really going to, differ from project to project, person to person. So don't, if you hear people talking about how many drafts they did or whatever, really do not take that onto yourself. Everybody writes differently. Okay, so as I said, this is a process, right? You really want to go through this. And number one, what I really want to make sure that everybody is doing in this, session at the school is writing that shitty first draft. You want your first draft to be bad. You want it to be messy. You want it to be disorganized because again, the purpose of it is to just get everything out on the page, right? So that's why I say you really want to overwrite. You really want to go, way over, write as much as you can. Let us help pull you back and help you decide what to keep and what to get rid of, right? Okay, right. So again, like I've been saying this whole time, you really want to adopt this reader-based approach, right? So what information does the text and the sentences on the page literally give them, right? If you were a random stranger and you only had this page to like get to know somebody, what would they know about you? In what order is the information given? Does that make sense for this audience, right? So again, literally think about the order of your paragraphs, the order of your sentences. I catch students in this all the time, right? They give me a really great detail, but they do it like 4 sentences after I need it, right? So think about, who your audience is. What do you need to explain? In what order is that going to make the most sense to them, right? For example, right, you don't need to explain what sutures are, right? If you're applying to med school, everybody there is going to know what a suture is. You know what I mean? Everybody there is going to know what cardiovascular surgery is, right? You don't need to explain those things. What you do need to explain is why that cardiovascular surgery experience was so intense for you, right? That's the part that they don't know, right? So I think oftentimes students spend a lot of time focusing on showcasing that they know all of these like technical details about medicine and healthcare and whatever, right? But really, that's not what we're looking for. What we're really looking for is not a knowledge of those technical aspects, but a knowledge of the overall lifestyle and let's say like ethical approach or like professional approach, right? That profession is taking. And also what kind of boundaries are there, right? Between you and your patient, that's really what they're looking for, right? That you really understand the kind of magnitude of this role, what you'll be doing day to day, and that you're okay with that. So I also tell students, think about including some of the grossest, most unpleasant parts of healthcare, right? Because chances are, no matter what occupation you're choosing, you're going to have to do something pretty gross with bodily fluids at some point, right? Don't shy away from that, right? You can talk about those things too, because if you are okay with the grossest part of the profession, you'll probably be okay with the rest of your duties. You know what I mean? So again, when we're thinking about stories, when we're thinking about the personal statement, it doesn't have to just be super positive experiences. It can also be those negative ones, right? Those can be really valuable to kind of talk about. Okay, so let's pause right there and do some content questions because now we're going to kind of go into like the revision process. Okay, so there was an example of stereotypes and cliches to avoid. So let's go back to that slide, right? So again, you really want to just avoid these kind of really general statements, right? These general cliches and stereotypes about what healthcare is, right? So that you want to help people. I've always wanted to be a doctor. Okay, cool, but like why? You like came out from the womb like that? It doesn't really like give us any specific information. And that's really why these kinds of sentences are bad, right? It's just that they're so general that they could apply to literally anyone, and they don't give us a good insight into who you are and what your motivations for pursuing this profession is. Okay. Other examples of stereotypes and cliches. I mean, Sonia, maybe you want to chime in here. Are there other ones that you've seen?
Yeah, I put some in the chat. So yeah, you're right on the dot. I want to help people. I feel like that's a common one that I've heard, or I've always wanted to be a doctor or a physical therapist. Other ones that kind of fall into that cliche category is I love science and I like learning about the human body. Ultimately, like it's okay to say things, but you want to say more than that. Like you want to unpack it and provide more details as to why you love science and how that's related to, why medicine's going to be a good fit or why, becoming a, podiatrist is going to be a good fit. So unpacking it is really key there.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, you have a limited amount of time, so it doesn't make sense to have a sentence that says, I love science, when you could have a sentence that says, I really love participating in the dissection laboratory or whatever, right? Like, why go for that general thing if you can literally just name the specific thing that you were excited about, that you loved, right?
Mhm.
Go for the specifics.
Yeah, yeah. And what you're doing there, Amanda, is like you're showing the reader the interest. You're
Mhm.
not telling them, right? So if there's like any book that I would recommend, it would be Ryan Gray's personal statement book. He talks about a variety of different things, but one of the things that he does talk about is the show don't tell method. And he's a person that helps students get into medical school. He's like pretty well known in the field. But I would say that that book is translatable to any other health graduate school application if you're not applying to medical school. So I do highly recommend it, or at least look him up. He does have a lot of like YouTube videos. So Ryan Gray is his name. He has a book on personal statement and also interviewing. So highly recommend.
Yeah, and I believe we have a link to his stuff at the end of the slides too.
Ah,
Um, okay, let me see. Other questions? There's another one. Is it necessary to talk about a specific extracurricular, or can we talk about personal experiences, relationships, struggles? Yeah, so again, you want to be thinking about what aspects of your character or personality you want to show. It could be highly possible that you actually don't talk about almost any extracurriculars in your personal statement, and you save all of that for your activities section and your interview. That's definitely possible and probable, depending on, again, your personal stories and how compelling they are and how well they kind of match up with those core competencies of your profession, right? Now, I would say that it's probably a mistake to not mention any, extracurriculars or any academics, right? You do want to get some of that in there. The personal statement is not a rundown of your resume, but it's also not just pure story time, right? So you want to tell stories, but again, you want to tell stories that show that you're competent in this field and that you're committed to this field, right? If those stories are not lining up with that goal, then don't include them. You know what I mean? But of course, those stories are really great for, qualities like resilience, right? Qualities like empathy, grit, let's see, determination, right? Compassion, all of those things. Those are great, opportunities for that for sure. Should people stay away from sharing vulnerable / difficult relevant life experiences in writing? How do you balance between being authentic without getting too personal? Yeah, that's really great. And I will say it's tricky. So the first piece of advice I'm going to say is come in and talk to us about it, right? Tell us your story and let us tell you A, whether it's appropriate, and B, how to make it appropriate. Usually it's the second, thing. There You should think about that many of these colleges and programs are still pretty conservative, right? You also want to be thinking about where these colleges and programs are located. Um, Not to pick on Florida, but if it's a Florida school with people who live and work in Florida, you might assume that they might have some specific Florida politics, which may not be super friendly to your vulnerable situation, right? So you do want to be aware again of your audience, right? You do want to err on the more conservative side, right? I'm not saying to like keep yourself closeted or anything like that, but you do want to kind of think about like, okay, if this is like a state that's passed a lot of, homophobic laws, like, do I even want to go there? Right. Do I want to include any of these personal details if it's going to make them judge me? Right. So you do want to be considering those things. Anything to add here, Sonia?
yeah, I think you were right on the dot. Like you definitely want to think about how you're framing it. I think a lot of reflection is important and thinking about like what did you learn from that experience? And then how is it applied to either like your motivation to pursue that field or a type of like characteristic that you want to highlight in your personal statement, or if it's like a supplemental essay. So ultimately highlighting that strength and that skill that you have is really important in talking about those vulnerable stories.
Yeah. So in this case, I would say, you want to keep the description of the incident to like 1 or 2 sentences, and then you want the bulk of what you're writing to be about how you overcame, right? Or how you recovered or healed, or, all of that kind of stuff, right? So really focusing on that growth mindset there.
Yeah.
Other questions about content? These are really great.
I did put in the chat common pitfalls, and we talked a little bit about it, such as like the cliche language and the showing versus telling. One of the other things I mentioned is reading like a resume. You don't want your personal statement to read like a resume. You don't need a copy and paste version of it with like extended like paragraphs about those different experiences. You want to talk about like only a limited amount of those experiences, maybe like 1, 2, 3 of those experiences. Ultimately, you're focusing on your motivation to pursue the field and also what has prepared you to pursue health graduate school or to pursue that field.
And I also find that a lot of students think that just saying the thing that they've done will automatically tell their readers what happened, right? So a lot of students will be like, yeah, I worked at with Cahoots and period over, right? No, right? What are they supposed to get about your experience? I think a lot of students think like, oh, okay, they'll see that I worked with Cahoots, they'll see that I have direct patient care. And it's like, no, not necessarily, right? You didn't tell us anything about the kind of care that you've given or any details, so we really don't know. So you really want to avoid thinking like, oh yeah, they'll see my sentence and they'll just assume what, I got out of that experience, right? If we wanted your help reviewing, do we just email it to you and then set up an appointment? Yeah, I would say that that's the best way to go about it. We do want some time to read your drafts before your appointment happens, right? So that we can give, the most informed feedback. If you don't do that, then you're going to have to sit there and be embarrassed while I read it in front of you. So there's some flexibility there, but yeah, emailing a draft to us and setting up an appointment is the best way.
Yeah, please email a draft to us. And also, honestly, I'm not reading the draft until probably like an hour or two before the meeting or the day before. So 24 hours ahead of time, that works perfectly fine for me. Amanda, I don't know what would work best for you, but typically I'm reading it like at least a day before, right before the meeting.
Yeah, I would say 24 hours, again, pretty typical. But I'm pretty flexible because, like I said, I've been doing this for a while, So if you don't do that, then you'll just have to suffer the embarrassment, right? As I read through it right in front of you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I wanted to mention is in terms of like the extracurriculars section of your application. For folks that are applying to MD school, so AMCAS, we mentioned this in the deep dive workshop, but I do want to mention it here as well. So you get 3 experiences that you mark as most meaningful, and you get extra character space to talk about those most meaningful experiences. And so think about that as you're writing your personal statement, because you don't want to repeat the same story that you are talking about in your personal statement to what you're talking about in those most meaningful. You want to diversify those stories. You want to tell different parts of who you are. Ultimately, your application should be one larger story of who you are and all of the different qualities that you have. It should show your well-roundedness. And so we're talking primarily about the personal statement today, but it's really important to think about the application as a whole, what stories you want to tell here versus your experiences section versus supplemental essays. And then you're going to have an opportunity to communicate all of these experiences in your interview. So it might be helpful to look at the core competencies, to think about, the different competencies that they're going to be evaluating you on, and how to communicate those different skills and strengths that you have around those competencies, and still use the show don't tell method in those experience descriptions.
Think about the size of your story, right? Like, again, how much background information do we need to know in order to even just understand like the context of the situation that you're describing, right? So again, today I reviewed a personal statement, or no, I reviewed an activity section where the student was talking about their experiences in their fraternity, right? But they kind of started their story in the middle of like a scandal that was happening in their fraternity. And I know the goal was to kind of show that they were able to, have all this interpersonal work and, conflict resolution and things like that. But without really knowing and understanding like the scandal that happened, I couldn't really understand how he was showing that conflict resolution because I didn't really know what the conflict was, right? So when I saw that, I was like, this is an excellent story, but this is something that you want to tell during the interview, right? Because you'll have the time to kind of go through the details and give that kind of rundown of the event, what happened, and why it was scandalous or whatever, without having to worry about your character, right? So again, think about what kind of details they need to have in order to just plain understand, right? For the activity section, is it a similar writing style to personal statement stories, or is it more just listing resume style? For the most meaningful experiences, it is more of that resume style, but you have extra characters for those meaningful experiences, so you can tell more of that story, version of events. Right? Does that make sense? All going to be dictated by the character count at that point, right? Okay. Okay. Other content questions, or do we kind of want to talk about the next part of the process? Okay. So we'll go ahead and move on to revision tips, right? Okay, so you've written a shitty first draft, right? Maybe you've sent it to some person to read. Maybe you've sent it to one of us to read, right? Like, what do? So one, you don't necessarily need to wait on feedback to start making changes, right? Read your draft out loud or print it out, right? Getting out of that mindset, right? So, like I said, when you're writing, you're entering a particular mindset. If you're doing it on the computer, when you read it off of the computer, your brain just goes right back to that moment in time when you were writing it and actually starts to fill in all of the gaps, right? Because your brain's like, oh, yeah, I remember thinking this thought. This is what we were thinking about that day. Us, everyone outside your head, we don't have access to that, right? We don't have your brain filling in the gaps for us. So if you read it on the computer, it can be really easy to kind of slip back into that writer-based position and forget to look at your essay from the viewpoint of your reader. So switching up the mode in which you're reading your draft can actually help a lot. It's the same principle as when you're writing, you don't notice anything. When you print out your essay and go to turn it in, all of a sudden you realize there's like a million typos on the first page. Same thing. You didn't notice them when you were on the computer screen because you were, again, locked back into that memory of doing that writing and doing that thinking, right? When you print it out, all of a sudden your eyes are like, oh, this is different. And then your eyes start to see, oh, wait, that's not spelled right. There should be a period there. And you start to see all those gaps, right? So change up the modality. Think about doing something like a reverse outline, especially if you're a person who likes to free write, right? Do a complete draft and then take a look and summarize each paragraph in one sentence. If you can't summarize it in one sentence, you've got too many ideas in that paragraph. Once you're done with those one sentence summaries, you can take a look at them in the order that they're in and ask yourself, do they make sense in that order? Should I move some of these paragraphs around, right? Because when you look at those one sentence summaries, you should see that kind of progression of logic, right? Okay, this is where I started in my journey. This is the middle of my journey. This is where I'm ending, right? Sometimes your paragraphs are a little bit out of order, and all you need to do is reorder them in order to make that make more sense, right? And of course, take it in stages. Don't try to fix every single issue or error at once, right? Try to focus on larger conceptual stuff. So like I said, the first couple of drafts are, what am I even trying to say? What am I showcasing about myself? What do I want to be talking about? What do I want them to know about me? Right? And you're going to read through kind of at the paragraph level and think, does this paragraph tell something about me that I want them to hear? Right? Once you get past that point, right? Once you realize like, okay, these are all the stories that I do want to tell. That's when we get into that more sentence level writing, right? Where we're going to start talking about things like style and language and vocabulary. Don't worry about those things when you begin your personal statement. All of that stuff is really more for the end. Okay, so what should you do now, right? So one, set weekly writing goals, right? Again, have that timeline of drafting, right? Think about your life, think about the time that you're spending on whatever you're doing, right? And do a schedule that makes sense for you because throughout this whole thing, you want to be as least stressed as possible, right? That's where you're going to produce the best kind of stuff. So plan ahead of time, right? Start drafting early, right? The initial drafts are the hardest part, right? Getting started is always the worst and the slowest part. Once you have stuff down on the page, it's easier to revise. It's much faster to kind of get through. So, be thinking about that, right? Plan to get a lot of feedback, but be willing to reject it, right? Again, is it genuine feedback that makes sense? Or are they just misunderstanding you and you just need to clarify, right? Um, Revise, revise, revise. You cannot write well without revising. And honestly, that is the only thing that makes a difference between good and bad writing is how often and how long people spend on the revision process, right? And then, of course, schedule an appointment with us, right? We offer 1 hour appointments to go over personal statements. During those 1 hour appointments, you could also go over supplemental essays and responses. We could do the activities section. We could even look at your resume, right? Basically use that grad essay review service in Navigate for anything that's related to your written application work. Okay. Okay, resources, right? So as I said here, right, we've got that link to that Ryan Gray book. There are also these 2 med school personal statements, again, really applicable wider than med school, right? Like these are kind of good models for pretty much every kind of personal statement for health grad schools. They're all kind of, the same vibe, right? The Career Center also offers feedback, as does the TAEC. So you can get writing feedback from those places as well as us here in pre-health advising. Yes, and Sonia has pointed out that this can be an emotional process, and that's totally okay. I mean, it's definitely embarrassing and it feels gross. I think everybody feels really weird about writing about themselves, and it's not, pleasant. That's fine. That's normal.
Yeah, I would say like it's a very vulnerable process, right? And if you're struggling through it, like that's absolutely okay. Like we're here to listen to your story and to help you find those nuggets of gold. So don't be
Mhm.
afraid to talk to us. That's what we're here for.
Mhm. Yeah, and actually, Sonia, that is the exact metaphor that I use when I talk about drafting and revision. So the drafting process is exactly like panning for gold, right? I don't know if y'all did this. I mean, I'm from California, a gold mining state. So when we were kids, they took us to the museums and stuff, and we were like panning for gold, right? They gave us the little plates, and we would stick it in the dirt, and then we'd shake all the dirt out in the water, right? And feel the gold, which is probably fake. Same thing here, right? You want to be able to kind of shake away these irrelevant sentences and details, and identify those real golden nuggets of experiences, and those golden sentences. And then you want to just revamp your paragraph to help those things shine, right? It's the same thing like you want to, exhibit a diamond by surrounding it with like a lot of black velvet. We want to make sure that the surrounding sentences in your paragraph are all kind of highlighting this experience and what they're supposed to know about you from this experience. Yeah, I think that's the last slide. Ooh, right on time. So other questions, feel free to ask. I will say that overall, this whole process is really more about perspective than anything else, right? Sometimes you can't get there on your own because, again, we have this habit of like downplaying the things that we do. You know what I mean? Whenever I ask somebody, like, what are you proud of? It's always like a real struggle for them to say, because we're not moving through life thinking, like, oh, I feel so proud of myself at this point, right? So sometimes it's worth it to just come in and like, talk through your ideas, have us say like, hey, but that's actually a really great story. Maybe we should talk about that. So again, if you're really struggling, I encourage you to reach out and make an appointment. Again, having that different perspective can really help you kind of get your thoughts in line, and really minimize the fear and anxiety that comes along with a project like this.
Thank you all for all your great questions. That's been great.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, if you've got nothing else to talk about, thank you very much for attending and have a good rest of your week. Of course, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or problems.
Thank you.
Yeah, grad essay review, Nicole, that's it. That's the service that you'd use.
Oh, yeah, if you don't see it in Navigate, it's probably because we're booked for the rest of the month of February because we're transitioning to high traffic weeks. And we're like on drop-in Monday through Friday, 10 to 3 in week 8 and 9. But we have availability in March if you want to call the front desk and schedule a grad essay review.
Mm-hmm.
You're welcome. Thank you.